According to the 2022 Data Breach Investigations Report, the human remains the number one driver of breaches today, demonstrating that cybersecurity is no longer just a technical challenge, but a human one as well. But how do you manage the human risks of cybersecurity? It starts with measurement. Only by effectively quantifying human risk can organizations engage employees with relevant activities to truly change human behavior. That's human risk management. Map key human behaviors to the business risks that matter most to your organization for free by visiting securityweekly.com/living security.
Mimecast has released its State of Ransomware Readiness Report for 2022, finding that most cybersecurity leaders experience the same or increasing numbers of ransomware attacks over last year. Together with Mimecast, organizations can stand strong in the face of cyber attacks, human error, technical failure, and work protected. Mimecast, work protected. Visit securityweekly.com/Mimecast to learn more.
Welcome back to Business Security Weekly. I'm your host, Tyler Robinson, and I am joined by Jason Albuquerque and Ben Carr. Security Weekly listeners save $100 on their RSA Conference 2023. And this is RSA. You need to save every dollar you can there. Full conference passes are available with that $100 off. The RSA Conference takes place April 24th through the 27th in San Francisco and on demand. To register using our discount code, please visit securityweekly.com/RSAC 2023 and use the code 53UCyber! I don't know who came up with that code, but that's great. We hope to see you there. Now, let's hop into the news. I am very fortunate to have two other hosts here to kind of dive in on some of these because Matt left us a nice chunk of news to cover. Some very similar ones to the ones we usually see on IT Security Guru. But the first one's on how to succeed as a new CISO. And Ben, I really am curious your take and a couple of your veteran pro tips to kind of get started as a CISO and then how to succeed as a new CISO.
Yeah, we could spend hours on this topic. There's a lot there to cover, right? I'm sure Jason will concur. I mean, look, when I read through this article, I think one of the biggest thing is creating connections. It highlights that, right? I think you've got to figure out who the other players are on the E staff, who you've got to align with. It's like you're on Survivor and you're trying to figure out how to best create the relationships that are going to ensure your success, because you can't get anything done without people. And whether that's, hiring your own team, figuring out what the personalities and who you have to have, or whether that's trying to figure out, who the people are on the E staff or who the relationships are on the dev side or the engineering side, that you're going to actually need strong relationships to get things done. I think that's the most important thing. I think a lot of people, we talk about this a lot on the show in the past, is that they default into the technical issues, right? What's the technical problem you're trying to solve? And I think, quite frankly, Jason, tell me I'm wrong, that's the easiest thing to solve. It's the hard things are the people problems, the education, the relationships, the community, just what's the tone at the top, and how do you get buy-in that we've got to make a change and we've got to do things more securely. So. I said a lot there, but I'll leave it.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, typically when I go into a new role, the CISO role, I give myself a line in the sand as well. And you're absolutely right. It starts with building relationships. And I think bringing it to that 50,000-foot view as well and saying, what is the business I'm hired to secure and mitigate risk for? You got to understand the business, right? So you have to make relationships with the business units. You have to make relationships with the leaders. You have to understand how the business operates and how the players operate. You need to build relationships with your own team, right? So you can get that current state. But typically, I like to put a goalpost out there. And normally, you get these articles about 90 day, your first 90 days, what you want to do. I typically say 120 days. I'm going to go back to my CEO and I'm going to give you a report of my findings, what I've discovered as a new leader here within the organization. I'm going to give you a brief on current state. I'm going to give you a brief on what future state should look like. And then we're going to work together as a business to eliminate the gaps, right? What are those gaps from current state to where we need to be future state? And then what does that roadmap mean? Is it a multi-year roadmap with investments, with some financials? So having that line in the sand kind of forces you to go learn the business, learn the players, and then you have to design a report, right? And you have to give a briefing, brief to the CEO, briefing to the CFO, and maybe even to the board of directors. But it creates a little bit of accountability for you to put that out there right out of the gate, right? I'm going to bring you a plan. I'm going to bring you a brief.
That makes a lot of sense, Jason. I agree with you on that. I mean, I think you've got to set that kind of target, because if you don't, it's like anything. You don't have a target you're aiming for. It just sticks out there forever. When you were talking, you said something, and it jogged a memory for me that I'd say you also have to make peace with the business. And what I mean by that is, you said educate yourself on the business and understand. I think you really do need to understand what the business is. And I think, again, far too often we get caught in this black and white of we should do this and not do this. And really, it's what is the business? What is the business about? What is the risk that you're willing to take? What is the risk that the CEO and the board and the other executives are willing to sign up for, and what aren't they willing to sign up for? And that should inform your perspective on how you approach staff you hire, technologies you implement, roadmap you set out. Because if you don't make that piece to really understand the business critical component and what the risk tolerance is, man, you can just be way off in what you think is the right thing versus what the investment is the business is willing to put forward.
100% agree. And I think vice versa. I think vice versa, though, because the business needs to understand your organization as well. I've walked into too many, coming in the door, walked into too many business units as a new CISO, and they really didn't understand cybersecurity and risk management, right? Yeah. And they didn't understand what our mission is about. So it's having the business understand the future of what cybersecurity is going to bring to the table and educate them that, we can also be business drivers. We can also impact the business and innovate with the business and drive the company forward. So I think it's that mutual learning back and forth. And that way you build that respect, and you build that trust. That's it.
Yeah, it's a relationship. You don't enter any relationship that's one way. It's got to be a two-way street.
Got it.
That also means entering in that relationship, ensuring that you are aligned with that business out of the gate, and that your values and your expectations are set. Like you said, you have to be at peace with this, and sometimes that requires understanding and having the expectations set properly for yourself that this is not going to be a Google. You're not going to have all of the latest, greatest, flashy tools. You're not going to have unlimited budget to hire the best talent in the entire market. So are you okay with that? And if you are, then you can move forward and have those expectations set so that you can get to a minimum viable security that you're comfortable with and that matches and adopts to the business model. Because if the business doesn't have money and is not making money because you've spent it all trying to secure something, then that is not really a business, right? That's poor capitalism.
Yeah, like I said, we could spend days on this topic. It's a fun one. But for me, there's a ton of stuff on the forefront before you even take the job that you've got to cover off. You got to make sure you understand a lot of these things, right? What is the perception of the business to the investment to cyber? What is the importance of risk to the business? Like, what are they willing to do? What's the track record look like? And a lot of this stuff you figure out as much as you can before you take the role. But then, the rubber meets the roll, and you've actually taken the role, and you're trying to figure out, okay, how much was different than what I was told up front? And how do I then apply those learnings about the business when I get more intimate with it to actually do the right thing for both your role, your team, and for the business as a whole?
Yep, 100%. That kind of leads to our next story around mistakes that companies keep making and simple fixes. I mean, if they were simple, like there's a lot in this article that really just irked me. The fact that they call it top spy, like this was, I believe, deputy director for national intelligence. Like they were not a case officer. They weren't a spook. They weren't a spy. They didn't do cyber. Like these guys were getting intelligence briefings. So the whole title is just frustrating. However, let's move past that. They kind of talk about advantages of ransomware and what things are getting taken advantage of inside of companies. And really, these are things we just got done talking about in the last episode with Fleming. And it is getting the fundamentals right and doing the good things, because ransomware groups are after kind of that low-hanging fruit. That being said, I do take some issue with some of these. Like we've seen we've seen a lot of nation states kind of step in and use the smoke and mirror of ransomware and even some of the supply chain attacks in order to further government and or intelligence gathering operations. And so, while I do agree that ransomware is going to go after low-hanging fruit, they also are not shy towards larger paying customers that take a little bit more effort, and they have toolkits designed just for this. They will go after some of the bigger fish to get the bigger payouts, and they will leverage some of the nation state level tooling and or smoke and mirrors in order to go after some of those more secured organizations. So some of this I believe is spot on. We all know ransomware goes for the simple, and attackers are lazy, but I do take some issue with cyber criminals not going after fortified companies. If that's the case, like, I'm not sure how all these big companies are making it in the news, because some of these are not that bad.
I agree. I actually pulled that statement out of the article because I wanted to address that as well. I mean, I just don't think that's a good statement to make, right? Cyber criminals won't attack fortified companies. I don't think that's a good statement to be making, because at the end of the day, we know they're attacking companies who have put investment and have people, are trying to do as much of the right things as they possibly can, and they're still getting successfully attacked.
Yeah, for me, that's the old analogy of, look, if you've got your car parked out on the street and you don't have the club on the steering wheel and you live in a high crime area, well, you're an easy target versus the car in front of you that does have the club. Now, look, it's not that hard to overcome the club. So at the end of the day, like, if the target is juicy enough, people are going to go after it. Now, I think the axiom also applies that, if a nation state's coming after you, it's super hard to defend against, right? Versus, script kiddie, that's a bar you should be able to raise over. So it's like, what is the threat actor that you're trying to defend against? What is the investment you're willing to put into it? But at the end of the day, like, there was an article out, Rob Joyce from Tailored Access Operations, NSA, gave a talk one time, and he said, look, we have a bunch of stuff that's really, really cool to use to get into, to get to people's assets, but we don't need to use them because almost everybody is easily exploitable with very common stuff, low-hanging fruit that they just haven't patched or addressed. And so why would we burn an unknown exploit or compromise when we can just use something simple? And that's the issue, right? You've got to do the work. Too many people, like, you go in, and how many companies still don't have MFA, still don't have a good patching program, still don't understand what their assets are. It's really, really simple to do some of the basic stuff. It's, again, we talked about this, I think, in episode 300, just not sexy. Focus on the stuff that's really going to make a difference that might not cost you a ton of money, but can make a big, big difference, right? But the really, really expensive stuff doesn't move the needle all that far unless you've already gotten all that basic stuff done.
And it still blows my mind that so many organizations still don't have the appetite to do some of these core things. Like, it just rings in my brain. One time, speaking to a CEO of a company, and she literally said, "We will not have MFA in this organization." Utterly refused, right? And it's just amazing that people still think that way.
Yeah, maybe that should be one of your next say easy, do hard. Like, what are the fundamentals, and practically, how do we start deploying those fundamentals for the smaller companies out there? Like, what are the fundamentals that you need to get right in order to have that kind of minimal viable security to survive, say, base level ransomware? Script kiddies, automated, you're not the lowest hanging fruit out there. Now, we've seen a big shift in ransomware recently where there's enough of these groups and they've gotten sophisticated enough. They're good pen testers now, and their toolkit's starting to catch up with them to where we have to kind of set that bar a little bit higher for some of the other ransomware groups, right? We need to make sure that we understand what our risk level is, what our public exposure is, and what our threat vectors and threat landscape looks like as a company. Because if you're any kind of a public company or you have a substantial amount of revenue, not even a lot of employees, your threat profile is going to be much different than the mom and pop shop in, middle of nowhere Louisiana. That's a little bit different. So you have to therefore have a different minimal viable security. And I think we should tackle that in some stance. Like, what is minimum viable security for a small to medium business? What does that look like that would protect them against ransomware without having to have all the blinky lights and the tools?
And how do you change the mindset though, right? Because at the end of the day, like I said, that CEO, no matter who said anything, their own staff, a consultant, that CEO will not do some of those minimal viable security measures that are not convenient, right? That add a little bit of inconvenience to your day. How do we get that behavior to change? And this goes back to insurance mandates and/or some type of legislation that says, this is minimal viable security for an organization. I don't know, but you're just going to have those people who refuse, right?
When we look at maturity assessments, right, we often, again, we go back to technical things. We look at what's MFA, what's vulnerability management, like what are you doing, like what's your ransomware program look like, but we don't ask things like what's the tone at the top. Like I'm a fan of, one of the reasons why I'm a fan of Deloitte's maturity models, because they've got that in there, right? The top thing is like, what's the tone at the top? And if your CEO can't go to the head of dev and say, I don't care that it makes it harder or takes 10 seconds longer for your devs to log into an application because you have to use MFA, we're doing it. It's not optional. CISO says it's a mandatory security control. We're going to have to make it happen. That's what you need. You need support from the other staff members and ultimately the board and the CEO to say, look, if you say something's a non-negotiable, it just is. I'm going to trust you for it. That's what I pay you for, right? If your CFO came in and said, hey, this is just mandatory, like we have to have good, accurate accounting software and reporting, like it's just not optional. Who would tell the CFO, like, no, that's just too hard. I'm not going to run that report for you. Like it's adding time. Like it doesn't make sense. And it's not accepted anywhere else, but it's accepted here. Asset management, like we agree that we can actually implement this thing that's the best thing since sliced bread. It will stop ransomware dead in its tracks, but I don't know where half my assets are. So how will I ever get it installed? Like it's a non-starter. Like these basic things have to get done. And I'm just amazed at the number of companies that you walk in, talk to, or colleagues that we work with that say, yeah, we're not going to do that, or we can't do that here.
Well, and I think this is why a third of cybersecurity leaders are planning on quitting, supposedly, according to our next article.
Good segue.
It is. Look at how they flow. Look at how we build that together.
Yeah, the great resignation of cybersecurity leaders. I'm curious on the qualification of some of these numbers here and quantification of their actual percentages, because that's a high number. Well, honestly, we all dream about quitting. We all dream about going back and working construction. But at the end of the day, we all get sucked back into cyber because the pay's good and we all have passions for it. So it's really hard to replicate that in any other vertical, especially when you've dedicated decades to get to this point. So I'm curious who's resigning where.
Well, but read the statistics, right? Like it's not a 32% of CISOs or IT leaders in the UK and the US are considered leaving their job and going to install fencing. They're considered leaving their current organization, right? And Jason, you agree? I mean, we're not leaving the business. We're trying to find the greener pasture, right? We're trying to find the CEO who cares. We're trying to find the organization that realizes, hey, this is an important part of our organization. We should respect them, treat them right. Like I'm not saying give us infinite power. I'm just saying, like, take us as the experts in our field and let us do our job and help us, right? Assist us. And that's what everybody's looking for. And when you don't find it, you get a little bitter and sour on your role, and people tend to look for something else, especially when there's a lack of resources. The pay is high and it's easy to switch. So if I'm gonna live a stressful life, I might as well do it for 20% more money.
but that's it. I mean, it's the alignment of the CISO's vision, mission, morals, best practices with the business and being seen as a strategic component of the business, right? That if that's not there, then you're just tactical and you're that, that old adage of, security is just part of IT, right? You're just a technologist. And,
people want to feel valued,
trying to get out of that. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And go ahead, Tyler.
No, I was going to say that this is where the differentiation and the gap begins to become more apparent. I think the companies that are doing this well, having that top-down leadership support, building that culture, or open to build that culture while maintaining that kind of work-life balance, right? Like this is where you can acquire maybe some talent that you wouldn't have otherwise been able to afford, but you are doing it through the means of providing a good place to move to. So I think you're going to see the places that are doing this poorly losing all of the talent that they've somehow maintained and retained for a little while, but the shift is going to go to better companies that are doing better security, and therefore the gap in security between good companies and bad companies is going to continue, and I think it's going to diverge even further for things like ransomware to take advantage of in the future.
Yeah. I mean, burnout is real, right? I mean, no doubt about it. And if you're part of a leadership team and you're not paying attention to your folks and making sure they're not burning out, you're going to lose them, because we're all human. We can only take so much, and at the end of the day, if we don't have that support, we're not getting that balance between work and our lives, and that flexibility from our organization to proactively. I mean, we do it with our teams. We look at utilization to make sure folks aren't burning out. And then we have that good conversation and say, hey, listen, guys have been working really hard. You know what? Take Friday off. Do whatever you want to do, right? Take Friday off. If you want to go study for that certification that you wanted to go take, cool, that's fine. Go do that. Or if you want to just go walk around the park, go for it. Take Friday off.
Yeah,
but we have to be proactive in watching that.
Yeah, I think one of the things you hit it on the head, Jason. I think I was going to call it the make PTO mandatory, right? Like there are so many people that burn through that PTO, and I think as leaders, if we're not, I think I think we've talked about this again before. You've got to make sure you're taking PTO, right? You got to make sure as the leader of the organization, you're leading through example and showing people this is how we do it. Like I'm not going to be available 24/7. If a breach happens, I'm going to get on the phone and do what I need to do, but I'm going to prioritize my family. I'm going to prioritize my life, so I'm not burning out, right? And you have to do that too, as a director, as a an individual contributor. You've got to make sure you and your teams are taking PTO as well. And if you're not doing that, I'm gonna need to know why, right? Because otherwise, your team's going to get burnt out, and you're not going to be successful in the long run. So I think PTO, flexibility in work environments. Being able to go up to somebody like you said, hey, you've been working really hard. Why don't you take Friday and Monday off? Have a long weekend. Go spend time with your family. Man, it just pays dividends. It's the way to build a team.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, it goes right into the next article, Tyler, so it tethers in well. But yeah, you're right. You have to lead by example. You have to model the way, because at the end of the day, you're a leader in the organization, and you have a level of influence, and folks are going to be looking to you for that standard. How does the CISO operate? Are they taking care of themselves? Are they, working nonstop all day, every day till midnight, sending emails at 5 o'clock in the morning? And because at the end of it, you're an influential leader within the organization, and if you're modeling that behavior, your teams are going to follow it. So model the behavior that you want. Lead by example, right? Take time off. Stay healthy. You can't be a good leader to your team if you're not healthy, if you're not taking care of yourself, right? Because you're going to feel the effects of it mentally, physically, all of the above. So you have to take care of yourself.
Yeah. And you have to communicate those things effectively. Like you may be doing good things by example, but not everybody notices or has the cognizant emotional intelligence to see some of those things. So that lead by example, especially the article around the special forces and the military, like they're one of the greatest examples of that kind of chain of command. Do by example, have integrity, work hard, but also that example piece goes over into the organization. That communication piece is very important. Establishing relationships, like all of these things are like critical life skills that most good humans or high performers should be doing already. And if you're not, like level up on each one of these. You can always find room for improvement. And these ones have some fantastic lessons around the things that you see in the military that work really well.
Yeah, and it reminded me, on 300, episode 300, we talked about, leadership books that we're reading. And, I talked about Leaders Eat Last. It's the same type of model here, right? Modeling that example, modeling the way, communicating, build those strong relationships, right? But again, as a leader, you are modeling the behavior, and that's what the culture is going to become. Is that that culture that you're building is modeled after your behavior. You're setting the culture, right? So you're influencing that culture. So you have to lead by example. You have to have conversations, and communicating clearly is one thing, but listening and taking in that communication as well, because that's where the emotional intelligence comes in. You could uncover something, right, where somebody's burning out just by a simple conversation and listening.
Yep, 100%. There's quite a few good things to read through on that particular article, and if you've not read it, it's got some good stuff. One of the other things from our next article is really getting comfortable with things outside of your comfort zone, like being able to collaborate, being able to focus on strategy, things that you may not do on a daily basis, so you may not be comfortable with. Leaders really do have to get very comfortable around these topics if they want to be effective in an organization, especially in the cybersecurity realm. So this one was very interesting around some of the downfalls and the things that were holding people back from being comfortable with the strategy and talking about those strategies. So
and so many businesses, take that old school approach, which needs to be changed. You're building a strategic plan and you go shut yourselves in a closet, and it's 4 leaders within the organization basically building out the roadmap for the company for the next year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever you're building that strategy around, without any feedback, without any input, without any conversation with the community. And when I say community, I don't just mean employees. I mean employees, partners, customers, right? I mean, you know how impactful a client advisory board is? Extremely impactful, right? Having an employee advisory board, extremely impactful. So, we have to stop building strategy in a silo behind closed doors and then coming from upon high and dictating that strategy down. We actually need to work with our constituents, right? Our community, and work to build that plan together. Different day, different age, that style just does not work anymore.
Yeah, I learned that a long time ago. I worked for a large multinational, and when we had an issue and we were trying to solve it, and they came and said, "Hey, go fix this," and we said, "Okay, well, our initial response would be to fix it this way," but we stopped and said, "We're not going to respond that way. What we're going to do is we're going to take a survey." And we looked at 50 different people across the organization in different cross-functional areas, and we asked them questions about the actual problem that we were having. When we came back, the approach we took was a lot different, right? Because we looked at the organization, we looked at like what the actual root cause was and what the problem was. And we would have looked at that through tunnel vision had we not taken that approach. And so I think it's really important to get feedback from different areas of the organization. It's also why I'm a huge fan, and I'll hit this, hammer every time on this, is that CISOs need to be part of the conversation. They need to be involved too, right? Because if we don't understand what's going on in the rest of the organization, we can't create a strategy. We can't create a direction. We can't align to the business. So it's really critical that push and pull both ways for the security org.
Yeah, it's it. And a lot of times you'll hear folks say, we're not going to make decisions by committee, right? It's too hard, too much input, too many people. Well, engaging folks does not necessarily mean it's the decision that's going to be made a certain way. They're not making the decisions. What they're doing is providing you with intel and information so you can make better decisions as a leadership team, right? The committee isn't going to put the hammer down and, sign off on every decision. That's not it. It's about getting input so you can make good decisions. So I hate it when I hear people say that we're not going to make decisions by committee. That's not a good enough excuse.
No, we need feedback from the committee, right? We need input. Yeah.
Right.
We need to understand the problem with the committee, right? And then we'll make the appropriate decision based upon that.
You got it.
Well, make a decision on taking risks and conquering fears is our next article. So if you'd like to figure out how to dive in and take more calculated risks, I think that's an important characteristic that we all do naturally. I would say from those of us that either lead teams, have come up through management, been technical, and had to get to the point where we're doing more strategic and advisory work, that kind of calculated risk taking is something that like naturally our brains work through very quickly, from the logic tree all the way to risk versus reward, and then adding some business aptitude into there is where you start to really refine this and become an effective cybersecurity advisor. So I think this one had some interesting stuff.
Yeah, I mean, two major points that I pulled out of there. The first one is reframing your mind around what success and failure means, right? Because sometimes fear can lead you to poor decision. But failure, if you can reframe it as an opportunity to learn, even if you weren't completely successful with what happened, tease out some of the successes that you learned from that experience, right? So just reframe your mind so you're not afraid to take that calculated risk. The other one that I think is extremely important, and I call it my personal board of directors, have a support team. Have someone that you can bounce ideas off of, who you can, they say make a pro-con list. Well, that pro-con list you can run by your personal board of directors to get feedback, or they can help you build that pro-con list, right? So I think it's extremely important to have that personal board of directors, that support team that they call out in this article. So that way you have a voice to folks who can give you good feedback.
Yeah, that kind of personal bias and understanding and being very cognizant, that's where that emotional intelligence comes along, being very empathetic to other people, really reframing your mindset and understanding that you're going to have a bias, and what does that bias look like, and how do you take a different point of view from that? And that can be anything from how you were raised, what part of the country, nationality, even your personal history of events and prior companies. All of those things lend itself to your mindset and ability to frame a problem in the correct way. And the more flexible and agile you are and adaptable you are to kind of see outside of your own perspective and see the biases that you have, the better you will be as a leader and be able to look at the risks from more angles, so your ability to evaluate and calculate those risks becomes a higher adaptation and a better perspective for the business as a whole.
Yeah, I'd highlight that. Like, I think a lot of people perceive bias as a 4-letter word, right? And it is, but it's more important to know what your biases are and understand then how to take that into context, right? And this article called out, get the facts, and I think that's super important when you're looking at risk. Is you don't do it based upon opinion, right? You do it upon data. And a lot of times you'll bring something in and someone will respond in a way that's based upon fear or their prior bias or, the information that they have. But if you don't have all the facts and you can't put the data together accurately, you're not doing a great job as a CISO. You got to bring the data to the argument, be able to put that data together and say, this is what the facts tell me. This is the direction we need to go in. And I think it comes off. The reception's a lot better when you can put that fact-based proposal together versus just, well, I know that this is the way we should do it. Well, why do you know that? Like, your experience may be different from another person and they may respond differently, but if you bring facts to that argument, it can be a real winner. So
bring your A game. Bring your A game.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And gentlemen, thank you very much for bringing your A game today. It's been a pleasure as always, Ben and Jason. And thank you for joining us today. We'll see you next week on Business Security Weekly.